were John Leland's concerns a result of one religious group against another, and which groups? And you might want to remind people who John Leland was again.
Yeah, John Leland was the fiery Baptist preacher that I quoted during my remarks, who was such a strong advocate for separation of church and state, who worked with Jefferson in Madison to disestablish the church in Virginia, pushed for the same thing in Massachusetts and Connecticut, and just wrote very strongly all of his life about the great evil of state-established churches. I think Leland and some of the other pastors of his era, like Isaac Baucus and some others, some of these guys were so hardcore, they actually went to prison because they would not pay the church tax. So they're not doing it. And they were put in jail for that. A conviction like that springs from, I just think, a real strong principled stand that the state does not have the right to meddle in religion. Now, some of it was practical. Leland was a Baptist living in areas where Baptists were not the majority. So they were persecuted. They were, had these laws put against them. But I think Leland, if you read him, his views are so strong that even if the Baptist faith had been the majority faith, he still would have said that the government has no business establishing it or advocating for it, because the rights of Catholics then would be oppressed, and the rights of Methodists, and the rights of everybody else. He just believed that strongly as a philosophical principle. What's amazing is that Baptist faith now, represented by the Southern Baptist Convention, primarily, which is the nation's largest Protestant denomination, has just completely reversed on that question. The Southern Baptists used to be full of people who were just like Leland, real fire in their bellies for separation of church and state, argued that the government had no business promoting religion, were totally against official school prayer, tax support for religious schools. They'd speak out against that stuff. They helped form and found Americans United in 1947. But now the Southern Baptist Convention is completely the opposite. Wants to have official school prayer, wants to have creationism, wants to have government support for religious schools. They've totally flipped, because in the late 70s, the denomination fell under the sway of a fundamentalist bloc that has held it ever since. So that's what happens when you have this kind of fundamentalist thinking get control, and they just flip all the stands.
Okay, Fred, did you have anything to add?
Well, I've been working on a book called Free Thinkers in the American South for about 20 years. And in the course of research on this, I traveled all through the South. And I was in Virginia, and you're visiting libraries and universities and places like this, University of Virginia there at Charlottesville. But north of that is Montpelier, which was Madison's estate, probably, 25 miles or so. But out in the country, on this little country road not far from Madison's old place, is this monument to these imprisoned Baptists. And it was just, I don't think I'd ever heard of it, and I thought, I was thunderstruck. It was like, the up in the mountains, and there's the tablets and all that. You mean Baptists went to prison, trying to oppose the state? And of course, I started following up and reading the history. But it is very remarkable that the Baptists historically, way back to their beginnings, were trying to oppose the state authority. I mean, the Mennonites and those people come out of that same heritage and history, so it's quite a turnaround. Are you ever able to convince people when you give talks, if they happen to be of the more hard-shell persuasion, to say, I never heard of that, we ought to go back to that?
What do you?
No, I mean, when you cite these Baptists of the 18th century.
Oh, yeah. I mean, we challenge them all the time with that.
Is it effective, or they just shut down their pride?
No, I mean, I should point out that there are still many Baptists who do support the traditional point of view.
Right.
The Baptist Joint Committee, which is a group we work with in Washington, D.C., is an excellent organization of moderate Baptists who are very strong in support of the separation of church and state. And their director, Reverend Brent Walker, is a friend of mine, and also one of the great advocates of separation of church and state and religious liberty, I think, in the country right now. So there is still that, and we work with those folks. But the individuals that have fallen into the sway of the fundamentalists, as probably you know from your own experiences with them, it's hard to get them to reconsider some of their core notions. I mean, look at the existence of something like creationism, which makes claims that are just, demonstrably false, yet has millions of people who adhere to it. And no amount of evidence will shake them from it. It's a psychological thing that goes beyond my ability to explain.
Okay. Next, Rob, I think you talked about this earlier, but maybe you can give a recap. The question is, how much evidence exists of the debate during the Constitutional Congress about the separation of church and state?
Right. There isn't really very much evidence, unfortunately. As I said, the records of the discussions are very sketchy, Madison's notes. And then people sort of offering personal reflections afterwards, like this guy Luther Martin that I talked about, who believed that there should be some recognition of Christianity in the Constitution and who was kind of disappointed that there wasn't. The track record on Article 6 is a little better. I mentioned Article 6. Article 6 is that provision of the Constitution that says that there will be no religious test for public office. In other words, they can't make you be a Christian or a Protestant or believe in the Trinity to hold office, which a lot of colonies would do that. That was put forth by a delegate named Charles Pinckney of South Carolina. And he ran into some opposition. And as a result of that, the record on that is a little bit better, and Pinckney had to really press for that. He had to lobby for it. He carried the day, but it wasn't easy. So there is some evidence along those lines we can look at that's kind of interesting.
What about the prayer issue? There's several stories about that. Didn't Franklin say we should open with prayer?
Yeah, that's pretty well established. But again, it's funny. The religious right has rewritten that whole story. For those of you who don't know it, the Constitutional Convention met in Philadelphia during a hot summer. Of course, this is before the days of air conditioning or any sort of the modern comforts we have now. They're locked in this room. They're trying to do this thing. It's very difficult. They reach an impasse. I forget exactly what the impasse was over, but they just weren't making any progress. Franklin, which is kind of funny because Franklin was sort of a libertine, in his personal life. Franklin suggests a prayer. Well, some of the delegates were afraid that if word got out that they were praying, the people would think, wow, things must really be bad in there. They've had to resort to this, going down on their knees. Franklin made a very eloquent speech in favor of it. He called for it. He said something like, God sees the movement of every sparrow in the sky. He knows about our affairs. Surely we must appeal to him, or something like that. Well, they tabled the motion and never got back to it. That's the end of the story. No prayers. The religious right version, which Jesse Helms used to tell on the floor of the Senate when he was in the Senate, was that everybody was immediately swayed by Franklin's words and they all dropped to their knees and prayed. That never happened. Now, that's the example of sometimes how I said they just simply make things up. Now, that's an example of it.